If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Welcome to Considering Catholicism. I'm Greg Smith, your guide to the faith, life, and civilization that is historic Catholic Christianity. If you're a regular listener to the podcast, then you've gotten to know my Protestant friend, Ed. Ed and I used to work in the same evangelical, non-denominational, contemporary church for many years. Eventually, I left to join the Catholic Church, and Ed stayed behind. But about a year ago, Ed reached out and told me that he was becoming intrigued by Catholicism, and he was curious about why I had chosen to enter the church. Actually, our first conversation about it came because he had jokingly rewritten the lyrics to this standard Protestant hymn, "The Church is One Foundation," in a way that humorously expressed his growing frustrations with the evangelical church world. He sent it to me as a direct message on Facebook one night, and, well, that got us talking. So, for a couple of months, we met in a Mexican diner, and over tacos, we'd talk about the church. After a while, I suggested that we start recording our conversations and put them on the podcast. And these have become our Church Chats with Greg and Ed episodes. Since then, a lot of people have asked me about Ed and what's he going to do? After all of this investigation and consideration, is he ever going to pull the trigger and become Catholic or not? So I asked him. He and I sat down and he shared where he's at. We compared our stories, and then he asked an interesting question. How Catholic can someone be without them actually becoming Catholic? I know from some of the emails that I get that many of you are exactly where Ed is at. So take a listen to this conversation. And if you'd like to share your story or you have any questions or thoughts, please write me at greg@consideringcatholicism.com. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to invite you to join me for a once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage this Lent to walk in the footsteps of Jesus and the apostles. I'm leading a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to walk where Jesus walked, and to Turkey, the ancient Roman province of Asia Minor, where Paul and the apostles preached and the church was established in its first centuries. Now, you can work with our tour operator to arrange air travel from wherever you live. We'll all land in Israel on March 20, 2023. That's just 3 weeks before Easter. And over the next 10 days, we'll visit all of the major biblical sites in and around Israel. We'll go to Nazareth and the Sea of Galilee to see where Jesus recruited the apostles and he performed miracles and preached the Sermon on the Mount. We'll have Mass on the mountain where Peter, James, and John witnessed the Transfiguration. We'll go through the Jordan River Valley and stand where Jesus was baptized. We'll visit the Judean wilderness where he was tempted by Satan, Bethlehem, and the Grotto of the Nativity where he was born. In Jerusalem, we'll go to the Upper Room where he held the Last Supper and appeared after the resurrection. And just before Passion Week next spring, we'll walk where Jesus suffered his passion, from the Garden of Gethsemane to his trial and the Stations of the Cross up to the Rock of Calvary where he was crucified. And we'll see his empty tomb. Now, at that point, you'll have the option of flying home, but some of us will be flying to Turkey for 4 days discovering the cities of the New Testament, Ephesus and Colossae and Hierapolis and Sardis and Smyrna. This is where Paul preached and planted churches, to which he addressed the epistles of the New Testament. We'll have a priest along with us, and we'll celebrate Mass every day. Now, for the details on prices and accommodations and all of that, go to consideringcatholicism.com. consideringcatholicism.com. And on the top of the first page, you'll see a big Lenten purple banner that says Holy Land Pilgrimage 2023, join Greg Smith in Israel and Turkey for Lent. If you click on that, it'll take you to the information and sign-up page on the 206 Tours website. Now, to make sure you're a part of our group, make sure that you sign up for the group with my name, Greg Smith, and use the trip code GS110221. I know that we have listeners spread around the United States and in many other countries, and that's no problem. You can work with Liz and their amazing staff to make your arrangements from wherever you live. But time is short. We're leaving on March 20, and, well, as of today, that's less than 4 months away. If you have any questions for me, shoot me an email, greg@consideringcatholicism.com. And I hope that you'll join me for the Lenten journey of a lifetime. Welcome to Church Chats with Greg and Ed, where Greg and his Protestant friend Ed chat about the church.
We have been doing this for quite a while now.
We have.
This started way back when I sent you the rewritten hymn.
I remember that.
I rewrote the lyrics to the Church's One Foundation.
That was hilarious.
I'll have to blog that.
Yes, you should put that on the blog.
Okay, which showed to me already, now that I think back about it, how far I had already come.
Right.
And probably just in denial that there was really only one option left. And
so when you sent me that the first time, I remember turning to my wife and going, he's half in the bag.
Right. Well,
and I actually had told Corey, who also appears on the podcast. I told Corey, I said, "Oh, Ed's half in the bag."
Right.
And Corey's like, this is good. He would be a powerful ally.
Right. Well, the thing is, I was running out of places to turn.
Right.
And I just hadn't, it was the last thing I didn't want to think about. Right. Anyway, so that's been fascinating. It's been like almost a year. I think it's been a whole year. And I have to say, if anybody is listening to this and wondering where I'm at with this, I'm very, very drawn to it. And I can't think of a reason why I wouldn't do this. Okay. Why I wouldn't convert.
This being
converting to Catholicism. Why I wouldn't join the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But it's a big change.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, and I have lived in Protestant world very publicly for a long time. So this would change the entire fabric of my life.
Yeah.
That feels like a cliche to say, but there it is. I can't think of a better word. So I need to proceed slowly. And I know you did.
When it changed everything.
But you were several years before you actually.
Yeah, we'll get into this.
There were practical reasons to not do it.
Well, yeah, I had my job,
right.
Was being a Protestant pastor, and all of my and a writer, and I worked for a Protestant publishing company, and I was a consultant for, Protestant ministries, and it was basically kissing my career goodbye,
right,
and kissing all of my professional networks and colleagues of 30 years goodbye. It was basically walking off the cliff, and so it was pretty scary. But to your point, for myself, it was a slow walk,
right,
and I think we'll get into this here in this conversation. But there came this point where. Yeah, there came a point where I couldn't. It wasn't like I just woke up one day and decided to become Catholic, or that within 12 months I went from 0 to 100 miles an hour.
Right.
It was really a 20-year long journey.
Right. And if now that I'm doing this and I look back, I think, well, I've been headed in this direction for a very long time. I just didn't see that, right?
That's the way it was for me. I think there's a difference between when you're in it. I think that's just true about a lot of stuff in life, right? You look back and you see how your trajectory in life was leading you to a place. And I could look back after I entered the Catholic Church. I could look back 20 years or more and see how incrementally those steps that I was on steps that were gradually leading me closer with, the infamous road to Rome.
Right.
But I was gradually step by step in various ways getting there. And I had reached a point, my wife and I had, where we were kind of ready to do it and sort of accept the consequences, especially, really professional consequences, my ability to earn a living,
right,
my whole professional world. And yet we delayed it for 3 more years after we were essentially had decided to do it for, various reasons.
Well, and, I don't want to, the balance of this is, I don't want to be disruptive to the world around me that I live in and my family and all that. Neither.
Yeah. Well, in my case, if we're just going to kind of compare notes here, so at the time that there were all these, again, my career was working in and around, the Protestant world.
Right.
But there was one thing that my wife and I did that was really dear to us. For a number of years, we had led a college ministry group.
Yeah.
Among other things that I was doing, we had a group of, long story, but it was a group of college students that we discipled. And it was, up to at various times, 40, 50, 60 of these students. And there was a core of a couple dozen, that were super important to us. And, we'd seen these kids from, and ironically, that group, Corey, who appears on the podcast, was one of them, in the early years of that group.
Yep.
But we just loved these kids, and we were really wrapped up in their lives, and they just mattered to us.
Right.
And so we had gotten to this point where we were like, well, I guess I'll deal with the loss of income and deal with the professional hits, but I just can't say goodbye to these students.
Right.
They would come over our house for dinner and we would talk about faith, and they would graduate from college and ask me to perform their weddings. And we just were so involved in their lives. And I just couldn't, my wife and I just didn't feel like we could step away from that. And so every year for about 3 years, we were like, this is the year I'm going to resign my jobs and kind of step away. And then we were like, but the students and so and so and so and this student and that student, and we just, it's not. We're going to get one more academic year,
right?
And then we'd get through the next spring, and they're like, okay, next summer we'll do it. We'll pull the pull the trigger, and then we'd get to the next summer, and these students are coming back for the fall, and these students are coming back for the fall. I'm like, wow, we just one more year,
right?
And then one of it was my own son had gotten engaged and asked me to perform his wedding. And, I'd baptized both my kids, and I thought, man, I wanted to be the person who baptized him and married him. And so we were like, oh, one more year until that's over. And then we hit this 1 year where it was like my son's wedding had happened. And then a bunch of the students that we were closest to were graduating as seniors and weren't going to be coming back. It just felt like there was this break, like the incoming class. It's like, if there's ever going to do it, this is the time to make the break. And then we just decided to and pulled the trigger. So I guess, to affirm what you're saying, there's a timing. There's a timing of it that feels right. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I don't want to rush in and be disruptive, like I said, and all that. But there's good stuff here, and I don't want to miss out on it. And I'm okay with missing out on a blessing because I'm of some sort, because I'm trying to do the right thing. That's all fine. I just don't want to end up thinking, oh my gosh, I've shot myself in the foot. There's no way.
Right.
Okay. So it's a balancing act there, right?
Well, I'm just trying to affirm. I know I want to affirm. I think my point of telling my story on that one is that I think that you have to consider those other people in your lives.
Right.
There's other people in your life. You're not an island.
Right.
And I feel like the Holy Spirit kind of prompts you and says,
right.
And in our case, there were people in our lives, these students and whatnot, where we felt like the Holy Spirit kind of isn't giving us permission to go because it would cause this disruption in lives and relationships that it's just wait. We're since wait one more year. So my plan is to just trust God about this in hope and in the knowledge that He will work things out, and I'll hopefully see it and know it when I see it.
So this leads to a question, though.
Mm-hmm.
How Catholic can I be without actually being a Catholic?
Yeah, right.
I mean, I know I can't participate in the Eucharist, for instance.
Right.
I know that. But what about asking Mary and the saints to intercede for me? I mean,
Right.
What about praying the rosary? I mean,
Right.
would it even work, or do I need to be confirmed and entered before? Is like Mary and Saint whoever, they're going to be like, well, no, dude, you're still a Protestant. Just,
You don't have the member card.
You don't have the member card, right? Exactly. And most importantly to me, how does God look on all of this, me doing these things when I'm not part of the Catholic Church, and where does that leave me, right?
So, wow, what a good question, right? And, I think this conversation for this episode is, it's kind of personal where
Right.
you're at.
Sure.
And so, I could give you like doctrinal answers, but I think, and I'll say some things that I think are true, from that standpoint, but just kind of relate it back to what I experienced.
Right.
I think that I had, as you put it, kind of become Catholic long before I entered the Catholic Church.
Right.
And I think of that famous G.K. Chesterton essay, Why I Am a Catholic. He was a convert. And he said, well, I could give you 10,000 reasons, but they all boil down to, I came to believe that Catholicism is true. And I think for myself, that gradual movement towards entering the church, the infamous, road to Rome, was a matter of starting to gradually believe the truths of the Catholicism and then incorporate those into my life.
Right.
And that was a step-by-step thing. So I think, when I go back, I started to believe certain Catholic doctrinal truths. Like when you and I we had the episode about the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Right.
And then, we had a follow-up episode because you came to sort of like had this epiphany, right?
Right.
And you go, I had that same moment, where I was like, oh my gosh, I think this is true.
Right.
And so on and so forth. So one by one, these kind of Catholic doctrines. So in a sense, that was kind of intellectual conversion of believing that a lot of these things were true.
Right.
And then I was like, okay, so what do I do about that? So I began to incorporate Catholic practices in my life. So I think you and I have talked about this in some previous episodes. I went and got a rosary.
Right.
I started, to pray the rosary in my car. I YouTubed how to pray the rosary. And to your question is, does it work if you're not a Catholic? Of course, right? I mean, there's nothing in there, right? I'm praying to God, praying the Our Father, praying, to the Blessed Virgin Mary. It isn't like she's going to say, jokingly, hey, you don't have your member card.
Right.
So you're going to Costco and you don't have your Costco
turn
card.
you away at the door.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah. Or you go up to the checkout counter and you want to check out or get the hot dog at Costco and they won't sell you the hot dog because you don't have your Costco card. Right. It's not like the Blessed Virgin Mary is going to say, I'm not going to listen to your prayer because you've not yet gone through RCIA and entered the church. So I began to incorporate some of those things. I began to pray the rosary, and I began to learn some other Catholic prayers. I began to read Catholic literature, Catholic prayer books. I began to sort of do these things, and then I started to go to masses. Now, I couldn't go to Sunday Mass because I was working at a church on Sunday.
Right.
But what I used to do was to slip over to a weekday Mass. Like a noon Mass at a nearby parish once a week or twice a week. And so I would kind of just, slip over there and sit in the back. And I didn't know what to do really. So some of that was, again, going to YouTube and figuring out what the parts of the Mass are and sort of, looking that up on the internet and kind of self-learning because I was kind of trying to be incognito and just keep it below profile. But I would slip in the back and I would kind of kneel and genuflect and sit in the thing and I would do the parts of the Mass that I could do, and kneel. I couldn't go take the Eucharist, but I still did the other parts. And, when the Blessed Sacrament is out, when the priest exposes it and elevates it, I, prayed and recognized what it was. I couldn't participate yet. So I began to incorporate Catholic prayer into my life. I began to incorporate Catholic to the best I could, Catholic devotional practices, and I attended masses when I could in some small ways, and began to become familiar with that. And I began to visit some other Catholic churches. Like when I was traveling and had the occasion to slip into a Catholic church and walk around. I remember a couple times I was on trips and I was in some city where there was some big, beautiful church, and I was like, I'm just going to slip in here on my own and walk around and pray.
Right.
And believe that God would hear my prayers. And I began to incorporate Catholic moral teaching into my life. Not that I was doing immoral things, grossly anyway, but I started to think like a Catholic in terms of how I conducted myself and how I understood, moral truths. And in my case, the irony in it is, and I know you were part of that world because that was back when I was at that church, for about 3 or 4 years, every time I would teach, whether on a Sunday or a midweek teaching, or even the college students, I was teaching from Catholic commentaries. So I had gotten a catechism at the Catholic Church, and I was looking at Catholic commentaries. So if I had a Bible passage I was teaching on or a lecture I was giving, in the Protestant church, I was actually going to study that passage and figure out what it means and, whatever. I was actually going to Catholic sources. And then I wouldn't tell anybody that. Right. I would just stand up and say, well, this is what this passage means and blah, blah, blah. And it was kind of funny, like ha-ha funny, but not, maybe it was ha-ha funny. But, people would come to me afterwards and go, well, that was really great. Those were some new insights in the passage. That seems really great. Like I never considered that before. And I'm like, yeah, well, Well, I remember you saying, excuse me, that you thought that communion should not be served by anyone other than officers of the church, appointed elders and so forth. And I didn't at the time make the connection at all to Catholicism, but I remember thinking, well, I like that. That seems right. Yeah, I found myself in that time and place where I was working in the church, or I was working with churches, or I was doing, college student ministry or whatever it was, that I just began to incorporate a Catholic worldview and Catholic understanding and bringing that to the questions that were there. So, back to your original question, how Catholic can you be? Well, I think my worldview had become Catholic. I think some of my doctrinal orientation had become Catholic. I was incorporating Catholic prayers and practices in my life. I was reading Catholic books. I was reading Catholic novels. I was listening to music, or, I had a rosary. I was going, at least slipping away, quietly to weekday masses now and then in a church where nobody knew me.
Right.
And so in some sense I had. But if I go back to, the early church, like, the first centuries of the church, I think there were people who were in this position, the church used to call them catechumens or whatever, but there was a period where people were in transition.
Right.
And I think I was in transition for a number of years. And so when I finally pulled the trigger, my wife and I pulled the trigger, and we went into, RCIA, and RCIA is basically the new members class to Catholicism. Right. And we went into that. It just felt like we were now completing the journey, a journey that we'd been on for a long time. We'd been step by step, and that journey wasn't always conscious, but now we were bringing it to fruition. And the time was right. The relationships in my life were right. I was ready to step away from the places I was working and the people I was working with. And I was ready to step away from the college students. And we were just ready to finally do it. And so I guess back to your question is, there's a time when you feel ready, but I think you can, again, begin to practice or incorporate Catholicism and Catholic faith in your life as part of a transition to entering the Catholic Church.
Yeah. This gives me comfort because I don't want to do this wrong, and I don't know if this is a topic for another podcast, but I'm also just pretty much doing this on my own. Right. You know what I mean? I'm not surrounded by other Catholics. I have a few Catholic friends, and I get some support there, and that's great. Yep. I just last night started an online conversation with a real-time friend, a guy I never see anymore. Yeah. Because long story, but friendly relationship, and we started chatting last night online, and he's he's been listening to the podcast, and I'd say he's maybe about 50% of the way where I am, and
he's half in the bag.
He's half in the bag, and I'm like, we were talking about this, and he said, well, I suggested that we start a Protestants Anonymous,
right.
Get the T-shirt and everything, recovering right. Protestant T-shirts.
Yeah.
But we agreed to pray for each other, and I'm happy for an ally there. So this is good. This is wonderful. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not worried about my eternal salvation. Right. I want to do this right. I'm sure that God is looking with favor on this, and so he will along the way,
Right. Well, so we get emails from listeners, and if you're a listener, please send an email, because I'd love to hear your stories or your comments or your questions. Greg@consideringcatholicism.com. But we get emails from people who are listeners of the podcast and are entering the Catholic Church or going through RCIA or trying to decide whether they should go through RCIA and enter the church. And we had one recently from somebody who they and their wife have been listening to the podcast, and they went to the first session of an RCIA class at a local parish. And I guess it didn't go well the first night. They just didn't make a positive impression. The leader of the class and how it was organized and how it went off, and their experience wasn't positive. Okay. And so this individual and I have had a couple of exchanges back and forth, and he said his wife was like, okay, we'll go try this. And it wasn't a positive experience. So she's like, yeah,
right.
I'm not in, I'm kind of like ambivalent now about it. And he still wants to keep moving forward. So he's like, so what do I do? Do I pursue RCIA, without my wife, or do I wait until she's ready? How do I do this? And so, we've talked a little bit about that, and I don't know that there's a hard and fast answer. I certainly don't have, and I certainly don't think the church has some hard and fast answer about the timing and how you deal with that. I think this is a discernment issue and discerning the Holy Spirit and the timing. But I would say that people are going to move down that road to Rome at uneven rates.
Sure.
And they start from different places. So for some people, their road to Rome is a 1,000-mile journey, and some it's a 5-mile journey. And they're going to move at different paces. And so, but on the other hand, I guess the only thing I would flip around on that is, you can't maybe, and whoever's listening, you can't kind of endlessly use that as a reason. But look, let's be honest. If you've got a spouse, it's best ideally you want to enter the church with your spouse if there's children. I've seen people come into the church where their spouse just won't do it, and so they pursue it themselves. But again, those are very personal decisions and the timing. And I think most priests and most pastors would say, use a lot of wisdom, a lot of discernment, a lot of judgment, listen to the Holy Spirit, and believe that the timing will work out. But be that as it may, there's no reason why you can't begin to incorporate Catholicism and Catholic faith and Catholic practices into your life, Catholic thinking into your worldview. And there's no reason that you can't engage in going to the Mass, even if you don't take the Eucharist. There's no reason you can't do all of that. And so I think I think in some sense, Catholicism can enter your life before you're technically Catholic.
It's there are clearly many things I could be doing. You just listed them. I could be praying Catholic prayers, and I can be seeing the world through Catholic eyes, and I can be reading Catholic things, and all of that. That's just good stuff. There's just no reason not to do that.
Well, and going to the Mass, every Catholic church, every parish is going to offer a daily Mass, or almost all of them do.
Right.
Where you can go and slip away at noon for 30 minutes or whatever time of day that they hold it. A lot of times there's a noon Mass, and to be able to slip in there and do that. There's a couple of things that, you want to be able to do. I remember, I think you and I talked about this once. One of the things that I couldn't wait to do was to go to my first confession.
Right.
And that was huge for me to look back and go, wow, there were all these things that I just really wanted to not only confess, but hear absolution for.
Right.
That was really powerful. And of course, I wanted to take the Eucharist. But it was really kind of a good experience for me for a couple of years to slip away and just go to the Mass and sit in the back.
Right.
And for me, just now, this is for me and maybe for you, because we've both spent a lot of time up on the platform at church in the front. And I remember back in those days, you and I used to talk about how, it gets really weird when you're on the bright side of the lights, right? Like ministry up there and doing the show every week.
Right.
And I had, from the time I was in my early 20s, I had been at the front of the room, leading, teaching, giving the sermon, leading the class, leading the Bible study, conducting the worship service, doing the wedding. And it was really wonderful to slip into this little urban parish that I used to go to.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it was, Wednesdays at noon, slip in the back. Nobody knew me.
Right.
Sit in the back row and just attend Mass every Wednesday or every Tuesday, Thursday or something, and then slip out and have, in a sense, not have a role. It was humbling. It put me in a place where I really focused and I went in and worshiped and I wasn't getting in front. And so, you can do that. And there's also, I think, a discipline accepting that you can't take the Eucharist. Let me just point out real quickly that there's other people who are in states of life where they can't take the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm.
So there are Catholics who maybe they're in a state of life, like maybe they've got an invalid marriage, or whatnot, where they need to refrain from the Eucharist. And there's people who go to Mass for years and years and years and years, not able to take the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found was to go and simply participate in the Mass, to worship and without coming down to receive the sacrament, to still participate in the Mass and adore the sacrament was really huge. And I remember one time I went to adoration, which is where the sacrament is exposed and you pray before it. And that was really powerful to me. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can begin to do this. But then the other thing is just to figure out in your life how God wants you to move forward, especially with respect to those other people.
Yeah.
And I do think there's one thing to say it's like your spouse or something. It's another thing to say, again, for some of us, you're going to have to, there's no way you're going to get down this road without leaving some people and things behind.
Well, and with the case of almost everybody, I'm just rebellious enough to say, well, I don't care what you think. Right? There are people who in my life who really care what they think. And so I'm going, you hit on something great. I realized early on that I have approached God and church. I've approached church by being a musician.
Right.
That's always gotten me right in to the inside immediately. First week, right? There's no place in our little town where I can go that it won't come to light. Yeah. That if people, I'm retired. Well, what do you used to do? Ooh, we need a guy this Sunday, Yeah. And my impression is that just from listening to, from the Catholic weddings I've been to and so forth, that there's really, my special set of skills is really not of much use.
It's like that Liam Neeson thing in Taken. I have a very special set of skills. It's cultivated over a long career.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
I play surf guitar.
Right. So I can do all these things, but I don't see that there's really much need for them.
No, there's not going to be a surf guitar mass. But that's part of the brilliance of the whole thing. I thought when I came in, honestly, I never thought I'd be leading a podcast like this or teaching, Lane or doing the things that I'm doing in the church. I assumed when I walked out of my Protestant world that I was done teaching and preaching and teaching Bible for the rest of my career. My full conscious understanding was I left it behind because entering the church and being part of the church was more important. It was more important to me to be part of the church than to lead the church.
Right.
And I fully assumed that I would never preach, teach, do anything like this ever again. And it's kind of a God thing how this kind of came back about. But it's
Well, if God asks me to pick it back up, I'd be glad to. But
it's real important that you go in and that you enter the church for the right reasons.
Right, and I don't. It's of enormous comfort to me. I'm eager to just walk in the back and walk out, and walk in and walk back out, and not feel like, oh, I'm a bad person. Because
it was
I'm not
really,
up there.
really liberating to enter the church. It was so liberating to just. Because from like the time that I first became a Christian and I was working in a campus ministry and I started leading like dorm Bible studies and campus Bible studies. I mean, I had been a Christian 6 to 12 months and I was leading Bible studies, from my time I was 21 years old. And I had never not done that. And it was just so liberating to slip into this little urban parish at, noon or whatever, a couple days a week, and sit in the back and just be part of the church. And I think that was part of my discipleship journey, that God wanted me to spend some time in that place. And I didn't try to change that. I didn't like come in and go, okay, I'm going to do this for 6 or 12 months and then I'll start a podcast or I'll start, teaching. That all came about another way, and kind of, I didn't volunteer. I kind of got asked. So I think it's good for your soul to do the right thing for the right reasons at the right time.
There is no fear that I'm doing in my own heart, that I'm doing this because I want a place at that table. As far as being up front or anything, I would be very happy to not be up front anymore. That'd be great.
And again, you're going to leave some things behind. I still have all of these Protestant colleagues. One of them said to me the other day, all of your friends would just love it if you'd stop talking about all this Catholic stuff on your podcast and just make it more like generic Christianity, because we all we all miss you. And, couldn't you just turn this podcast into considering, stuff or something, and I'm like, there was no way to bring some of those people along. And I had to, in the end, is discernment of the Holy Spirit of vocation, what God's calling you to do, and you had to do what you're going to do. And I was grateful enough that my wife came along and we made this decision together. So again, I think you got to find your path forward on that.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ed.
All right.
Thank you for listening. My name is Greg Smith. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, would you please hit the like and subscribe buttons wherever you get your podcasts? And please share it with others. And if you're curious about the Catholic worldview and faith, the Church and its saints, or Catholic history, culture, and art, then visit consideringcatholicism.com. And email me to let me know what you think. Greg@consideringcatholicism.com.